Cool. So after we know that when we set state, render happens. So basically, setting this set state is the function that is mainly controlling the updating portion here. When you set state, that causes. Oh, actually, there is this example here shows what are the causes for render to happen again. The causes for render to happen once again is the component receive new props. The component set state method was called, or a function that we haven't seen called force update was called. I have never especially needed to use force update, but as its name indicates, when you want something to forcefully update, to forcefully get the component to re-render. Again, I haven't seen a use case for it just yet. I've been able to do just fine with set state and new props. So the component renders and is displayed to the user. Oh, this yellow here sort of represents the internals of React, like all the stuff that React does. React updates the DOM, the actual DOM, and references are basically like where the nodes that React is touching in the actual DOM are kept. But in updating, let's say you set state, render happens again. Right after the render happened and the component is displaying the new information, a function called component.update gets called. Right? And this function, let's see an example for component.update. On component.update, you can implement functionality like let's say you have you're creating a chat app, and the user receives a new message, right? The user receives a new message, and then you're gonna set the state with that new message, right? The component renders again, and in component.update, you could fire a notification that will pop up on one of the sides saying you have a new message, or color thing slightly different. That will be a use case. And then for unmounting, we basically have one major one, that is component will unmount. On the example that I gave earlier, let's say for the example of a feed component, a feed and messages that we are able to switch between tabs. When the feed first mounts, what I want to do is display a spinner to the user so that the user knows that there's something loading, and I want to fire a network request to go get the feed for my users, basically. And let's say they just quickly click on the next on messages. They're not interested in the feed. On component, what happens in there is, let's maybe do that example here visually. So let's say we have our app, and we have feed, and we have messages. Right. Now so here let's say this is the internal structure, right, of our components. This is represented here. But let's now here represent what the user is actually seeing. The user will just see app. Well, I want the user to be app. Maybe we have here a tab menu where they're gonna pick from, and I want the user to be the tab menu and the feed. Right? So sort of this is what it's going to look like. This is our general structure, but this is what the user is seeing. The app, we have a tab menu where the user is going to pick one of two tabs, feed or messages. And we have our feed, because that's like the default tab. When they come to our app, we want to show their feed. That's the first thing that we want to do. In this case, so let's say this component, when it was first created, it first mounted, we fire a network request to get all the feed for the user to display. And let's say the user clicks on the tab menu to go to messages, because they're not really interested in the feed. What happens is the feed will get unmounted, and the messages will be mounted. Right? The messages was mounted. But on the feed, we started that network request to get all our posts, basically, all our feed. We don't really need it now because the user was not interested in that. That process, right before the component is like sort of replaced or mounted or unmounted, we had that function component, that this function will be fired. The component will unmount, will be fired. And that's where we can cancel the network request. Or we can cancel anything that we might have started that we no longer need, because the component that is that was using it or that was needing that is no longer going to be displayed to the user. So anytime you any cleanup, like the component did mount will unmount is a function that is just used 99% of the time for cleanup work. Stuff that you want to happen as they're closing or they're moving away from the component. Questions in general. I know that we are talking about conceptually, and we're going to see how it actually looks like in React. But questions, comments? So the lifecycle. So we are able to write like small apps in React now, and there this thing that are going on sort of under the hood that we can take advantage. I think for some of you, the ones that we're going to be using the most is a component did mount, a component will unmount, so third component did update. But I'm sure that you already have thought about, oh, I want when the page first loads to do this thing. And that will be a use case for component did mount. You're going to see that this one is the one that I think, in my opinion, is the most used, component did mount, because you want stuff to happen as soon as the user sees, or as soon as the app loads, basically, or your component in general loads. Cool. So we talk about the two phases. The render phase is everything that gets executed right after the render gets called. And then the commit phase is everything that happens after the render happened, after the DOM has been updated and the user is seeing something. Like on this gray area, I don't know if you actually don't see any difference. Or like this top area, the user, this happens really quickly. Like that's something I should have mentioned earlier. This all happens really quickly. Like a user doesn't know that all this stuff is going on, but this top portion, basically the render phase, the user is not seeing anything. This is sort of the creation of the component and the initiation of the actual displaying. And then right here in the middle, or like this line, is when the component is being put into the DOM. The user starts to see stuff. Once that finishes, once all these components are mounted, then the component did mount gets called. Also, that's like another thing where, let's say if we have this component app, so mounting this component, we think that you just mount app and everything mounts. But under the hood, actually has to mount app and has to mount the children of app. And then only after all the children of app has been mounted, then we can say app has mounted, right? Trying to just come up with an analogy. Yeah. So basically, any component won't be considered mounted until all its children are mounted. Right? So in here, and we're actually going to see this. Let's say we're going to put a console up, for instance, on component in mount, and we're going to see how. Actually, we can do it with this example. We can see how the donation list, or depending on the order, the donation list will be mounted first, then the progress will be mounted, then the form will be mounted, then the top bar will be mounted. And the last thing that we see mounted, or being mounted, is app itself, or the parent component. Cool. So yeah, there's some more like in depth in the description. Right, like this is what I was saying about during the commit phase, React takes the changes identified during the render phase and actually manipulates the DOM to make the UI reflect basically our state, whatever is it that we want to show, whatever state our application is in. If there's a drawer open, if the user is seeing the messages component or the feed component, all that. This one is also like very rarely used. There is another function that gets called on that, which is get snapshot before update, and I want to show you. I think we put a link here. This link, interactive lifecycle React, interactive lifecycle diagram, shows you this graph basically that I have, and it also takes you to the documentation. So make sure to check that out. So if I click on constructor, it's going to take me to the constructor documentation for a React component. And so these are sort of like the major ones. There are some other less common life cycles that we're going to just sort of touch upon so that you're aware. Hopefully once you see a case that maybe one of these words makes you think about, you will go back and review it and read the documentation. There's something that happens between the constructor and the render are two things. One is derive state from props, and the other one is should component update. I think, yeah, all the React in general is, all the naming is well done, so you can sort of start to imagine like should component update is a function that basically dictates should the component be updated to be re-rendered, or maybe it shouldn't because what changed was not really relevant to this component, right? Get snapshot before update. I've never really had to use this one. So this is an example for this one. Get snapshot before update. This one happens right like in the middle of the two phases that they call the pre-commit phase. This function called get snapshot before update. What that function will allow you to do is capture some information from the DOM, like the scroll position. This is something that like I don't know if you have noticed, but I think Facebook does this where when you click, so you're scrolling through your feed and you click on an article, you click on a photo to expand it, and then it shows you the article or whatever, and you click back, and then it takes you back to the exact place where you were before. That is something that like we take for granted, but in our case, we're gonna have to implement that, and the get snapshot before update can help us do that. Cool. Sort of like to read where the scroll position is so that we can restore it after. Okay, so those are sort of the major. Let's get into, I think, some examples. Now, lifecycle mounting, updating, unmounting. On the mounting, we get this constructor happens always first, render happens second, third, component in mount happens. So let's look at these ones. So I'm gonna go back to the code that we had yesterday. I think I shared this code on the lesson streams channel on a GitHub repo that you can access from there if you don't have it. But if you were here yesterday, you should have a good idea of what we did. Where did we do that? I think we did that in search solutions. Yesterday, the component that we had were this, basically, an app, which is our main component. It holds our state. We had a donation list that we call recent donations. We get a progress component form that we call donation form, and a top bar, basically, for just displaying. And we had, let's fire this. Oops. Huh. Did anybody else's code broke? I've never seen this message. No, but this is not in my code. This is Webpack stuff. Yeah, but I don't think it's that because let's do. Yeah, let's do. Or maybe. Let me remove the node modules and then install them again. What is that sticker that everyone has about work and code?
You just need to install the module, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. Uh,
Yeah, there's something. Tell you that later. You can get the right ones. They don't already got your It's like a spa.
oh well, I think I. Actually, I'm starting to suspect that it's me, um, because I was I was changing my node yesterday, so. Uh, oh yeah, it's the one, it's the version of Node that I'm using. I'm using a very old version. I'm using 6.17 because I wanted to see if something was different. I think it's use. System. Actually, you know what? Let's do this on here. So this is Code Sandbox, and I'm just gonna create a new React project here. Oops, create a React app. So this is sort of where you can prototype quick React apps, and we don't have to like do all that waiting. Cool. So here we just Code Sandbox gives you an even smaller app that create React apps, which is basically just this function with two headers. Also something that I wanted to mention when we talk about the component lifecycle methods. Those apply only to classes, right? Classes are the ones that have render method, the ones that have constructors. When you have a functional component, you basically has like on and off, basically. When the function gets called, the component is mounted, and then if the function doesn't get called, the component just never mounts. So you don't have component did mount, you don't have constructor, you don't have render, you don't have component did update on functions, because those are not class components. So that is another thing that you may take into consideration for when to have a component be a class versus having a component be a function. If you're going to take advantage of the lifecycle methods, then you know that you will need a class. A function doesn't have component mount, etc. So for instance, in this case, the app is just a function. There is no way that I could do component did mount, right? Because it's whether the function get called and the component mounted, but there's no way in which I could do something right after the component mounts, for instance. So I'm going to convert this to a class. Can everyone like in the back see this writing? Yeah. What I don't like about this is that there is cool. So let's do class app extends. Oh, also so since you now are destructuring masters, we can do here. Do you know how we do string react? That extends react that component, right? What we could do here, let's just fix this. Do that. Then let's do the constructor. Let's do super. And we're not going to have any state for now. Let's do a render. And just an extra closing curly bracket here. Oh, this seems to be having some auto formatting too. Constructor. You can ignore this like squiggle lines here. It says like there is a linter that is telling me that this constructor is useless. We see that useless constructor. That's because I'm not doing anything in the constructor. If I'm not doing anything in the constructor, I should just not include it. Cool. So we have this component. What I wanted to talk about is, so you see how we do React that component here? That is because component is a property of the React object. So we could destructure that if we say import React, comma, curly bracket for destructuring component. And we then can just say app extends component, basically. We're destructuring the component from whatever was exported from React, which is so we could think of the React object. Cool. So now let's put a console log here on the constructor, or let's just add some state so that we get rid of that warning. Let's say we have counter start at 0. And in here, while I'm in the constructor, I'm going to call a function. I'm just going to console log app constructor call, and then we're going to do in the render. I'm also going to console log app render call. And the purpose of this is for us to see start to see the life cycle. So we know that the constructor will be happening first, so we should see the console log app constructor call first, and right after the constructor we have app render call. So let's look at here at the console, and we have app constructor was called first, then app render was called next. As I refresh, I'm always going to see the same behavior. Cool. Also, these are you want the constructor. So do you remember like side effects? That functions can have side effects, like maybe accessing something that was not passed through their arguments, or maybe making a network request is considered a side effect. In the React documentation says your constructor and your render function should be pure functions. What that means is functions without any side effects. Meaning your constructor shouldn't like reach out of itself to maybe access a global variable, and your renderer shouldn't do that either. And they shouldn't do like stuff like network requests. Another thing we mean by pure functions is a function that for the same inputs it produces exactly the same outputs. And in this case, like the input to our component will be props for the props and state, basically, and for a component X with a state of let's say A and props of B, we want that component to always, if it always gets state X and if it always gets state A and props B, we want it to always render the same thing. If your component has certain props and certain state, that should always render the same thing if they are the same. Cool. So we see here that there's this order, and then let's now look at component did mount. So component did mount. Component did mount is just like a special name function, so you can't use it for anything else. So I just added component did mount, and let's say console log app component mounted. And now let's see our console log. And we see that first the constructor gets called, then the app, the render gets called, and lastly the component did mount gets called. When the component did mount happens, we know that the component was mounted. We know that then we can start a network request or listen for any kind of input from the user. It's you can think of it as the dump content loaded of React, right? Where you want to wait for stuff to have been mounted, to be there, to expect it to be there, so that you can manipulate it. Right? Cool. So questions maybe about this three and the order in which they're happening, and maybe more specifically component did mount. Yeah.
So just to make sure those functions like component did mount are inside of React.
Mm-hmm.
Part of React.
They are part of React, and they are special name functions like render. I can only have one render. I can only have one component did mount that does what React dictates to do, basically. Other questions or comments? Yep.
So if I'm following correctly, we want to park like a network request in something like this so after you get user input to use that for a query.
That's correct. Trying to think of another example as the app mounts. Yeah, like most of the time is like network requests to get the feed, to get the messages, to get the posts, to get the users. Trying to think of or just remembering an example where it's not like network request based. Yeah, but don't remember exactly one that is not network request based. Cool. So this is the order in which they're happening, and we basically are seeing what we described here. Sort of like on this mounting. When the component mounts, the constructor happens first, then render happens, lastly component did mount happens. And this is the order that we're seeing. Cool. So now let's look at updating. When we said that whenever we set the state, render will be called again, and component did update will be called. So let's look at, let's look at this example. So here, so I'm gonna say, let's have a button. to increase the counter. In fact, let's have two buttons. And let's display the counter here on a p tag, saying this dot state dot counter. So this is sort of like the example that we first did on React State about the counter app, basically, and is displaying a p tag with a counter that we start at 0 here in our state. And we want the plus button to add to the counter, the minus to reduce. So let's do a function here called like handle plus. Oh, and here you may notice something. Remember that on all event listeners you get the event. This is going to set the state. Let's bring the previous counter here first. Counter being this structure from the state. And then we say this dot set state. Let's do the set counter to be equal to counter plus 1. Not equal, colon. And I'm gonna just repeat the same thing for the minus. In fact, let's just forget about minus. And, let's say our counter can only go up. But the point here is that we're using. So now let's look at what we have as I refresh this page. And we see the exact same thing, which is the mounting, like the mounting related methods get called, constructor, render, and then component the mount. And then we see when I click this, note what's going to happen. I'm going to click this button, and the component did not update. Oh, thank you. Adding the event listener is quite important. So that we have an on-click event listener. And what do you think? Anybody wants to take a stab at what the order is going to be, or what's going to be different in the console log? Looking at this graph. I mean,
you have the last console log, which is the component with mount.
It won't have it?
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else? Anything else? Oops, this is not the one. So it means that it won't have the component mounted. But what you're saying is we're going to see constructor call again and the render call again. Okay. Let's thumbs up if you are with the mean. Okay, so what are the other options? Hugo?
It'll only call the things that. Well, my guess is like since like the component did not isn't like being called anywhere else, it won't appear again.
So Hugo is saying component amount will not be called again, and that's correct. What about so Hugo said component amount will not be called again. That's correct. What about constructor? Will the constructor be called again? Suzette says no. What do we know happens when you set the state? Right after you set the state, what's the next thing that happens? Render. So let's click on this. And as we click only the render method is being called, right? We see that the constructor got called only once. Right after the constructor was called, the render was called. The first time we saw the component is this render. Then after that, after the component was rendered or the component was mounted, then we get app component mounted. And then from there, we moved out of that like mounting state or mounting related area to the updating area, where we are basically here. We are basically in this area. Like once we do this for the first time, I keep changing. Once we see this for the first time, let's refresh this. Like right now here, my app is basically just waiting for user input, just waiting for for the user to do things, right? But it moved out of, it finished mounting. My app is full, ready to go. Now it's waiting for user input. That user input will most of the time mean you will be just updating your state. The user input is then I click this button. Then we know that render gets called, and then therefore we see multiple renders, as many renders as times I click this button. But this is important to remember that the constructor and the component in mount only happens once. They happen once and they don't happen ever again until that component is just removed and mounted again, created again. Cool. Any sort of questions maybe about this, about the what we're seeing about like changing the state and updating, rendering a new thing. Cool. So what would happen if I set the state in render? What happens if I say like this dot set state? Say that a little bit louder. An infinite loop. Because what we described earlier, in fact, we can just see it that it even just throws the error saying maximum update depth exceeded. This can happen with the component repeatedly call set state. This is another sort of like things that we want to avoid. Set state should never be called in the render. You get this infinite loop because what we said about what happens immediately after set state, because also what we are seeing here in this graph here. Set state just keeps in an infinite loop here. Cool. So we're clear that then when you set the state, render happens again. And if you think about it, this is the loop that makes this sort of loop between like the user, and I've described this loop a few times where there's some user input, that user input creates, set the state, update the state, then the component renders, and then some other input from the user comes in, that sets the state, the component displays a new thing. That loop is what allows us to do this. Like if we look at, maybe this with app render call, let's console log this dot state. And let's look here at the console. So we can see that the constructor is called, then the render is called, then the component mounted, final, like finish mounting, and we see it counter 0. When I click on it, then render happens again. Because render happens again, and now the state is different, then we display a different number here, right? And that's how like updates in React happen. Like this simple pattern basically of setting the state that causes render to happen again, and now we render because in the render we're saying I want to display this dot state dot counter, but now this time counter is a different value, is 2. Now we just show the new 2, right? And we can see in how app render was called, and we have basically a new state. we move from counter 3 to counter 4. Cool. So now let's look at component did update. Oh, also, anybody notice here's anything about these functions that I'm writing?
What is that? Events.
Yes, the ES5 versus ES6 things that I'm dropping here. So it turns out that we could, or the component, just for now, all the built-in the lifecycle methods you want to write in ES5. Actually, I didn't try if they work on ES6, so let's try it now. Component mounted. Oh, cool. So you could just write everything in ES6, and that makes it standard. There is something that I want to talk about later on, where this is sort of like the new way of doing things, using like arrow functions, and this is because arrow functions had an advantage where they keep this object, they keep the context referring to the class app, where when we had, and you might have seen, let me just show you here quickly, you might have seen this on tutorials maybe that you have watched, where the version of this handle plus here in ES5 look like this, right? But now here my counter doesn't work, and that is because this function lost the reference to this object, referring to the app component, basically. So basically, it kind of lost this, therefore it lost state, it lost everything. And it loses that because it is going here to this on click. I'll share some articles later on that dive deeper into that. There's something that we should know as JavaScript developers that I want to go more in depth later on. And what we will do for using this ES5 is we want to bind this function to the this so that the function remembers what the this object is referring to. And you might have seen at the top here that you do in tutorials, they show that handle plus equal to that handle plus. So that's sort of weird that it's equal to itself, but not really, because it's equal to itself called with the bind function. Once we have this, our app just starts to work again. And this is because here we're forcibly binding this function to have the this that we want, which is the app. So I know that this is sort of like a little bit abstract and hard to grasp at first, but just know that this is a way in which you might have found tutorials online that shows you how to do it. Like this is what we would do before like arrow functions. Then with arrow functions came with something called lexical binding. The arrow functions will retain the this of the context in which they're defined, and then we don't lose that. But with regular functions, we do. Yeah, later on, I'm going to share some articles, maybe at the end, that dig deeper into this. But just be aware that you might have like a bunch of event listeners here in like the ES5 way, the ES5 definition, and then at the top they bind them all. Like they just repeat this step, binding them to the this. Cool. So going back to the lifecycle methods, we have the component in mount. Oh, also, I guess I do like to keep this one ES5 because at least mentally for me, I avoid the possibility that I might confuse, even though I think this is unlikely, but I was going to say that it avoids the possibility that I might confuse the built-in method, the Lifecycle method, with one that I wrote myself. I think as you develop your React skills, you just start to know which ones are the Lifecycle methods, and you just remember them, and you know that those are special. So you could write them in ES6 or ES5. Since we'd write like the render as ES5, I do tend to prefer just ES5 for the React default methods. And then mine will just use the arrow function syntax. But as we verify, it doesn't really matter. Cool. So component amount, render. Let me see. Wait, can I share this with you? Oh, this is interesting. Let me share this link with you and see if, I'm not sure if you can change my code.
Can you say this to GitHub? Because that'll get next to GitHub.
Say that again?
Does it say directly to GitHub? Because you can log in with your GitHub.
That I don't know. I don't think so though, because then that will have to create a GitHub repo for this project basically. I'm not sure, to be honest. Cool. Any questions like to what we have seen so far of the order in which things are going to be happening? Just one question. I mean,
It's not about the order, but how the new props work to render the.
say that again?
Can you give an example of new props?
New props?
Yeah.
But you're talking about the.
If you see the graph, it says like set states or new props.
Oh, this one here.
Yeah.
But the more advanced one, right?
Even the top one.
Oh, this one. I see. Yeah. So this is this example that is talking about here is like we saw the set state example. Can we see the new props example? I think we can see. The new props example. The new props example is. Wait, this is not the one. This one. We'll need to have a child component. So maybe let's create a component here. So I'm gonna call it child.jsx. I'm moving on the source, and this is just going to do class, call it child extends component. And before that, of course, we always need to have React in scope. React, the structure component here from React. And then let's do render. Let's do maybe this in P that says child of app. And let's just wrap all this. Return. Cool. Let's see. Let's actually see this. Let's have a constructor here. And let's do So let's not have a state, just like that. And let's see a few things here. So from here, export default. Let's have this component appear on our app. So what we do here is import it, child, from the current folder child, and here let's just at the bottom maybe invoke the child component. Cool. So here we have this child of app, right? So we basically have app and child. Cool. We're currently just not doing anything with child, but let's see a few things here. On child, I'm gonna have the same thing where I'm gonna console log child component constructor call. And also render. Child component render call. And then we save that, and we have this, which I sort of mentioned earlier. The app constructor gets called, then the render gets called on the app. Then after that, the child component constructor gets called. After the constructor is called, the child component render is called. After that, then we have the app mounted. The app mounted was the last thing that happens. And this is what I said earlier, where app won't mount until all its children are mounted. And that's why we see app mounted as the last step. And if we have more children, we are going to see basically the same thing. App mount will be the last thing that happens. Once the entire sort of subtree has mounted. Cool. So that's something there. Now let's look at the. So what to your question, I mean, when this component receives new props, but one we're not passing props yet, but when this component receives new props, then render will happen again. So right now let's console log props here. Let's do maybe like props just to visualize it. This dot props, let's say here. And this is running out of space here, but I'm just console logging this message child component render call props just with an arrow for us to sort of identify it, and console logging these dot props. So we can see here that currently the props of the child component is an empty object. That's because we're not passing any props to the child, right? So let's do this example. Let's say we want the child to render double the number of this number. So if we click 3, we want the child to show 6, for instance. So for that, first let's do. So let's take. The child will need to receive a prop, and remember that you pass props in the name here, like in between the angle brackets. Maybe I'm gonna call this one like. This is just passing the counter, the same. This one's gonna come. This is a prop that we're gonna pass from app, and it comes from the state. So this dot state that counter. Now, so save that. Then note that here we're console logging. This is the state of app. Let's also do sort of the same format. We see the app constructor called and the render was called. This is the state at the moment of that render. Then the child component constructor gets called. The child component render gets called. And now we see some props on the children. We see this counter 0. That's because we're passing, app now is passing the counter down as props to the child component, right? And let's say we want the child to show double the counter. So let's do child app, and then just right here, let's do this dot props dot counter times 2. Let's do like child double counter. Child double counter. So what we're just going to show is the props multiplied by 2. So when I click on here, we see 1. The child counter shows double that, and will always be just double. Any questions up until that point about like showing it double? Yeah.
So where in the parent's timeline does the children's timeline get executed? Like, is it on the border in render infinite, or is it in the yellow?
That's a good question. It will be, yes, as you described, it will be sort of like here, right after the. So if we think about this, the child components go inside of the render of the parent, right? So it's like, if we think about it, like the React will sort of have to crawl the render recursively as deep as needed, because we have like we have this, right? So in app render, we are rendering something else. So now React has to go and render that thing. And if we have like deeper children like this, then this child will be like inside of the render of this child, and this child is inside of the render of this child, who is inside of the render of this child, who is inside of the render of app. So for React to render this, React goes into the render of this, but then it says, oh, I have to go to the render of this is rendering child. Then I have to go into the render of child. What is child rendering? Is the next thing, the grandchild app, and so on. So to answer your question, Joey, yes, it will happen sort of like in this middle area, where basically in this middle area, we have a whole new life cycle, as you described it, for every component, for every child component. Yeah. Other questions? So let's look at here. This one. So let's see what's going on here. So you could also think of like the child life cycle being wrapped by the parent, between like after the parent renders for the first time, and the parent mounting, basically, right? Where if you have other class components, they have their own life cycle, right? And then we have sort of this order: constructor of the parent, render of the parent, then constructor of the child. Because this is, again, because what I was saying, the child is inside of the render of the parent. So right after the render of the parent, we execute the constructor of the child, then the render of the child happens, and lastly, the app mounts. The app finally ends up mounting. And then we click on this. So note what happened when I click this. I click, and we have the app render call state. Oh, the app renders method was called. Now the state is 1. And note that the child render was called again. So this is this example. Where the prop that passed this counter, when I updated it, this counter was different. This counter that is passing as props is different. So that's new props, and then therefore child renders, right? And also note that when I did that, this is also some like internals of React. Note that when I did that, so we know that on the first go, when the component, the child component gets created, the constructor gets called. And we said the constructor of the child was called because, well, the child is inside of the render of the parent, right? But that only happens once, again, because even though here we clicked on this, set the state, update the parent state, and then render gets called again in the parent, right? But note that the child doesn't get created all over again. We don't see after the render was called, we don't see another child component constructor call, right? We only see child component render was called. So the the child component didn't get created all over again, even though like in the render of the parent we see here, in the render of the parent we are creating the child. React internally keeps track of that one, so it doesn't have to create it and call the constructor again. It just update because it sees new props coming in, and only the render happens again. So bottom line is like when you have nested components or constructor only get called once. Constructor will only be called once. No matter if it's a child component, that component only gets created once. And then here, the double, and then this is an example again of the child component being updated not because the state of the child changed, but because the props changed. Cool. So let's do going back here. Oh, we were talking about the updating. So let's look at this one. Component did update. So let's do that on the parent. Let's go on app. And let's implement this method. Oh, this is another, this is the standards that I took. I don't know if they are industry standards. I don't recall if I have seen them that much, but I tend to put the built-in methods or the lifecycle methods at the top. Then my methods are sort of in the middle, the handle plus, and the render last. That is just the way that I sort of got used to do it. I like to scroll all the way to the bottom to see what the component renders. I know that at the top I find the stuff that is predefined by React, like component did mount, and in the middle I get my own stuff. It doesn't really matter what order, if you put the render first, etc. Just something to keep in mind. So I'll do here, right after component did mount, I'll do component did update. And then let's say up component updated. So just as we saw it here, component did update will happen after render, right? So let's look at let's look what happens. So here we have just the regular stuff: constructor, render, child constructor, child render, app mounts. I click on plus, and then we get all the same stuff. Then we get app render, then the child render because it received new props, and then we see that the app component updated right after the component was set a new state and was called render. Then we get the component updated. Let me see. Let's go maybe to the documentation, that one. Oh, the interactive. component did update to sort of see. Oh, and we have these arguments that we can use: previous props, previous state, and snapshot. As it says, invoke immediately after updating occurs. This method is not called for the initial render. That's something important to remember. The component did update only happens right after a set state that caused a render, and it doesn't happen on the first render, right? Because the component didn't really update. The component was just created, right? This says use this opportunity to operate on the DOM when the component has been updated. This is also a good place to do network requests as long as you compare the current props to previous props. Network requests may not be necessary if the props have not changed. You may call set state. And like this is for like when you want to listen. A component, an update happened, and you want to check like when a component updates, when the new set gets set, is because basically something changed. And what you want to do with this function is check. Well, you may want to set the state if anything that you're interested in, like in the props or in the previous state, you still want to keep, or you're particularly interested in. And for instance, in this case, I think this example is. So this example, we have this.props user ID not equal to previous props user ID. Remember that this previous props. These are default arguments you get on this function: the previous prop, the previous state, and the snapshot. This example, I think, without having to look at the rest of the code, we could think of it. Let's say you have like on your chat app. So this is comparing the user IDs basically, and on your chat app. Let's say you have your feed, and you have your chat bubble or your chat or your messages tab, and let's say a new post was added to the feed, right? So that changed your state, right? That changed your state, and then your app will update, right? Let's say in this case. We want to check. Let's say now we have this component did update. We have it in the child component, in the messages component, because the main component. If we have something like this, say you have like your feed, where you have posts. Say you have your message here, where you type in your message. Right. Let's say a new post arrives. Let's say we have the main component, whatever this page is, and we have two main things. We have the feed and we have our messaging section. So let's say a new post arrives, then you set the state. The new post will pop up here, like at the top, and everything goes just down. In that scenario. What you have is all the components will update because the feed component, well, it will depend on where you're keeping the state. But let's say you're keeping the state on the main component, which is app, represented here by the outer square, and then we have two other components. In this example, we set the state when that new post arrives. And then the feed component and the message component will update both, right? As we saw on the plus example with the child component. Both get render called again. Now on the component did update, that we could implement component did update on the child here to check if that post, no, I'm thinking that maybe it doesn't really apply. I was gonna say, if that post for some reason affects the user, let's say we have a feature of, this might be a bit too contrived, but let's say we have a feature where when a user posts a message and you're chatting with that user, it will send you sort of like a message saying, this person just posted a photo, so you can look at it right now while you have this open. In that case, posting a new picture, if that photo is of the user that you're chatting with, could show you that pop-up there. We could say here on the component did update, if the user that I'm currently chatting with, which is represented here by the user ID, is not the same as the user who just posted the new photo, then I don't want to show the pop-up message saying that user just posted a photo. Right? If it's the same, we will want to update the state and then display the new bubble saying that user just posted a photo. So let's look at this in the console log. Let's see how we're doing in time. Component did update. Let's do it here, and also I'm gonna copy it to the child so that we also see it here. I'm gonna change this to, instead of app, just child. And then let's see what we have. So here we just have the regular stuff: constructor, render, app constructor, app render, child constructor, child render. Then we have component mounted. I update this parent state with the click. I get the app render to be called again because we changed the parent state. Then the child render gets called again because it received new props. Then we get the child component was updated because it received new props right after the render. And the app component is updated right after it finished rendering all its children. Here, let's look at, for instance, let's look at the arguments that we got here. Pref props. I think the other one is previous state. Let me just refer back. And snapshot. I have never actually looked at snapshot, so let's take a look at it here. So let's do maybe this. Console.log prev props. So let's see it. Let's console log what all this looks like. Prev state. And snapshot. Cool. So let's click to add one. And we have that then the app render gets called right after we set the new state, after we increase the counter. The child render gets called right after the parent render. We get the child to have been updated, and then here we have a reference to the previous props. Right? On here on the render that we saw earlier, we see counter 1 because this is the new props, And on the component did update, we have access to the previous props through previous state. Previous state is empty because, or is null in this case, because we don't have a state in the child. Snapshot is undefined. I'm not even sure what this snapshot will be. Let's see if they have something here. Oh, so this is only if we have this other method, which is rare to do get snapshot before update. And otherwise the parameter is undefined, so we can ignore that. The snapshot. But this okay. So then here we see another opportunity for whenever you want to look at whenever your component receive new props. Maybe for some reason you want to keep the previous props or do something with the previous props. Component did update will allow you to do that. Will allow you to access the previous props, which in this case, so now it's 0. These are the current props. Now the props gets updated to 1. We see it here in the child props. And once the component updated, which is where we are here, we get the previous props counter 0, where we wanted to keep the previous prop to maybe say, let's see an example for this one. In this case, I'm thinking, let's say maybe we want to keep a history of how the element has been like what are the numbers that the element has had, right? We don't want to lose the previous one. We could do. Yeah, the thing is, these are hard to see and use in like smaller apps where we don't have like a lot of things going on and a lot of things changing. Basically, you want to do component did update whenever you want to do something right after something happened to the component. Maybe we don't know exactly like where, as we have a more complex app. Maybe we don't know like, or it will be difficult to track what was the thing that was updated. But in component did update, it's sort of that opportunity to see, oh, if the new update is overriding something that I needed or that I wanted to be there, then I'm going to access here on previous props or previous state. Make sure that I don't lose that thing that I wanted, that I didn't want to lose from the previous state that we had or the previous props that we had. So this is. Just think about like whenever you see, oh, I want right after my component is updated, I want to do X thing or I want to do. I think maybe some of you had a use case for this, but even I think that will be actually wrong. I was gonna say some of you notice like a lag on I think maybe the clicker or one of the projects that we were doing. But that lag was because we weren't setting the state or we were not reading the state in the right moment. So that's not a good example actually for using component did update. But anyway, that's sort of the updating phase. The state gets called, the set state gets called, or new props are passed. Render gets called. Once render is done, then component did update gets called for anything else that you may want to do there. Cool. So then the last thing that we can see is the component will unmount. So let's do something for this one. I think, do we have? Let's try this. So let's say we're going to have another button that is going to say show double counter or hide double counter. And let's see how then when we're showing the double counter will be mounted to the DOM. When we're hiding the double counter, that counter will be unmounted from the DOM, and component will unmount will be called. On this one, let's do on app and just add another button. I'll click. I'm gonna say handle. This that handle double counter. Let's do show/hide double. Cool. And then let's write a function here. Handle double counter. That will just set the state. So we're in the state. We're going to have a property for basically show. If show, like the show double counter. If show is true, then we want to show the double counter. If show is false, we don't want to show the double counter. So let's get this first to work, and then we talk about the other. Show double counter. So let me bring the previous one here. Const show double counter. The structure from the state. And then I want to do this set state. I just want to set it to the opposite. So I'm going to say show double counter equal to not show the double counter. And then let's see. So here we can see on the first render, we have the counter is starting at 0, and the show double counter starting at false. When I click this, see if it changes to true. And we can see that when the app renders, show double counter changed to true. Now the next thing, so we get it to change false, true, and all the other chain of events get fired. You can see it here changing. So let's try now to hide and show this component based on that. So we are going to say in curly brackets, I'm going to say with using the ternary operator, we're going to say if show double counter is true, then show that, like return the child, what we call here, what I'm referring to as the double counter, otherwise return nothing. So let's do show this dot state dot double counter, show double counter, basically with a ternary. If this is truthy, then return the child, otherwise return null, which is colon null. And then do I have, oops, I put the null where was not supposed to be here. So we can see that as we have this sort of show and hide behavior. When I click this, the child gets shown or hidden. And this is, or any questions regarding maybe this behavior before we look at the compound did mount? How we are accomplishing showing and hiding with the handle double counter. Maybe like handle, yeah, I think handle double counter or handle show hide counter, something like that will be a better name. Yeah.
It's just the double negative that swaps it between the two.
Yeah, that's correct. So if, like in this case, if show double counter is true, then here we negate the true, which ends up in false, right? So let's say now it changed to false. Then the next time show double counter is false, and we negate false, then it goes back to true. Now it's true, and then the next time it's true, and we negate true, it goes back to false. And we're just setting the state. And here with this ternary, we're saying if this is truthy, if this is truthy, then just return the child component. Otherwise, return null or render null. Render the child component if it's truthy. Otherwise, render null. In that case, nothing is shown. When you render null, nothing is shown onto the screen. And then let's see now. So we can see here. Let's refresh this page. And if you have been paying attention to the console log, before when we were always showing the child, we will see that the child was, the constructor was called, the render of the child was called, and lastly the app mounter was called, right? Now we don't see that. Well, because this dot state that show double counter is false, therefore we never create a child. Let's create a child for the first time with show hide double. When I click this button, the state changes from false to true. Then this ternary says, oh, if it's true, then render the child. The child gets called here, and the child component render was called, and lastly, the app as a whole updated. Everyone like following up until that point? Now let's do let's hide it. Then we see that the render is called, the state went back to false, the app was updated. Now when I click it again, everything just happens again. The constructor now gets called again. The child component render gets called again. And lastly, the app component updated. But this is because it's based on this. Like once if we create, basically going back to my earlier statement about constructor gets only called once, that's still true. Here we sort of see the constructor being called on the child 2 times when I'm basically going from hiding to showing, because this component gets actually created completely again, instead of just sort of being hidden and someplace in the DOM that doesn't show. And so the component gets created again based on this variable. So this is, or any questions regarding that? This is basically how you can have functionality show hide on buttons, or like this is also basically how you could get functionality for open a drawer or close a drawer. Okay, so let's look at on the child, because so right now we are creating the child gets mounted. I think we have, do we have the component did mount on the child?
Can you save your file?
Say that again?
Can you save your index file?
Index, yeah. Oh, these formatted my turn array like that. Oftentimes I'll turn arrays I like to format in this way where I put it like this. I think this is probably gonna remove it after, just so that you get to see it. Like this, where we have, well, I just know that the thing after is the question mark, and this will be sort of if it's true. And on the next line is sort of the or of the ternary, which is the colon, and is, or if this is false. If this is false, then we render null. So it's either this one, the child, or the other one. As I say, this is probably gonna just format it the way that they set up the formatter, which still works. Cool. So let's look at, what I wanted to see was, when I click on this, then the component constructor is called, the component render is called, and I think we didn't implement component did mount on the child. So let's implement component did mount. Let's say child component mounted. And let's do this. As I click the button, let's refresh this. On the first go, there is no child. The child was not even created because we have this type of variables are sometimes referred to as flags. When it's true or false, sometimes people call them flags. So you could say if this flag is true, then we want to display, we want to show the double counter. If the flag is false, we don't. And then let's click on show. Now we get that as we click on show, then the constructor gets called, the first render of the child gets called, the child mounts. Lastly, the app updated. Then let's look at our final main method, which is component will unmount, which, as you may be imagining, will happen right before the component gets removed from the DOM. Yep.
It's beneath your personal methods.
Oh, wait. Yeah. Yeah, let me remove this. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll have it here. Component will unmount. Console. Wait, I don't want this on. I never, like in this case, we can't do it with like app because we never remove app. App is like always there, and this is like you will probably always have a root node, a root component that is always there, and you remove just child. So I need to move this one to the child instead. Not in the index. So let's try this one here.
Yeah.
Component will unmount. Let's say child component will unmount. And then let's see this. So we see app constructor. As I show that, the constructor in the child gets called, the render in the child get called, the component did mount in the child gets called. Then lastly, the app component was updated. As I'm gonna hide it again, we see that the state in the parent was called because we updated the state of the parent. And lastly, we see right before the last thing, we see child component will unmount. This is saying, this is sort of like, do you remember about what I said about the two sort of DOMs that React handles, the virtual DOM and the actual DOM? This is when React says, oh, it's comparing the actual DOM with the virtual DOM, and it says that the virtual DOM has a node that we no longer want in the actual DOM. When it's comparing them, or what is also known as diffing those, because it's checking for differences, when it sees that a component is to be removed, it's going to call this lifecycle method, component will unmount. Right before it actually sort of like janks it out of this, like right before React janks this component out, it's going to call the component will unmount in case you want to do any cleanup. And right after that, then the component just get removed from the component tree, and it's gone. And then we can sort of create again, in this case, show it, and destroy it basically. And this is sort of like, that will complete the circle where we have the lifecycle of React component. Let me see, I think we are on time. I think just so that we do the exit ticket right now, there are these legacy methods that you no longer want to use. They were called component will mount, component will update, component will receive probes. I had to like sort of learn them when I was around and these were around. Now they are labeled unsafe component will mount. They realized that the way in which people were using these methods were just leading to bugs that were hard to solve, and they just decided to go with a different approach, which is now the methods get derived state from props is one that came to replace a lot of this, and also in conjunction with the should component update. And that basically will conclude our lesson on React lifecycle methods. I think actually let's do the exit ticket tomorrow, just because I want you to see another example to have this a little bit more settled. So that's it for today. Have a good night.
Unmount child, that pushes your CSS off too, right?
That's correct. Yeah, like if you have CSS, right? Like if you have other elements on the sides, then yeah, we're gonna shift all the other elements to where the other one was. Yeah. Well, so if you think about that, like.
Well, it's the sort of thing like if you're accounting for it, you could slide over a new menu bar, or like you could make something drop down below.
Wait, say that again. What would be the example you're talking about?
Like when you click on a button and it drops a menu down.
Okay.
Like opening a drawer.
Oh. And you're saying it will shift everything down?
Would it? It probably would.
No, because in that case you will just make it. You will make it. The CSS will be like on a different Z index.
Oh, that's right.
And then it doesn't affect. Hold on. Ok, tienes un trabajar. Thank you.